Hello! Today I'm going to be reviewing the new Marilyn Manson album, We Are Chaos. But before we get right into the review, I have one story that I want to share, which is related to Marilyn Manson. It's a pretty good story. I think it's going to really put things in perspective. I've never told this story before. It's always been kind of a secret, and I hope it's okay for me to tell it. I hope people aren't going to dig into the details of the story and kind of figure out some secret facts here and there, but I'm going to go ahead and share the story now. So when I was in elementary school and middle school, and I think even part of high school, I think he was there, there was this guy in school a couple of years older than me. He was a couple of grades above, but he was always there. I always saw him. I think he was aware of me too, but I mean, we weren't friends or anything. I would see him every once in a while and kind of say hello or whatever. We had kind of mutual friends, I guess, but maybe. Anyway, he wasn't like a cool guy, and he seemed to be kind of having a hard time at school. People would pick on him. They would make fun of his the way he looked. They would make fun of the way he talked. He didn't really have a lot of friends. He wasn't super popular, and I always kind of felt bad for him, but I had my own problems as well, similar stuff. So anyway, I was just kind of aware of him there and knew what was going on, I guess. And then one summer break, everyone left school. A couple months later in the fall, we came back to school, and he was there, but there was a big difference in him. You could tell something had changed over the summer break. And what I found out is he had started a band over summer break, and he was the lead singer of the band. And he was writing the music, writing the lyrics, all that kind of stuff. And I guess doing that, it kind of gave him confidence or something, because when he came back, he was a different guy. People kind of gave him respect now. He wasn't like super popular, and he wasn't like friends with everybody or anything, but it was kind of like you could sense that something was different with him, and he had kind of found himself or something like that. He was just somebody you wouldn't make fun of anymore, basically. And anyway, one time I was kind of, well, more than one time I guess, but there was a time when I was having a hard time in school, in life in general, and I remember I was heading out for lunch break one day, and I was in the parking lot going towards my car, and this guy, he came up to me, and he gave me some advice. I guess he kind of knew what was going on or something, and we talked for a while in the parking lot. He gave me some great advice, and he gave me, we had a great talk. I won't go into the details of the stories he told me and then the information he gave me and the advice he gave, but it was important, and it kind of changed the way things went for me from then on. And from then on, we've been, we were great friends for quite a while. We kept in touch a lot, we hung out a lot, but then kind of drifted apart over time. I moved away, you know, split apart, different lives, whatever. And you're probably wondering what this story has to do with anything here. Well, I will tell you that a couple weeks ago, I was back in my hometown, and I was driving towards Albertsons, the local grocery store. The most recent Marilyn Manson album was playing in the car, and I was listening to it. And I was just thinking, like, man, I love this album. This is great. This is like an artist that I really like. And I got to the Albertsons parking lot, and I looked over and I saw the guy. He was there because he was still doing the job that he was doing back in those high school days, which is working in the Albertsons parking lot, wrangling up the shopping carts, which nowadays, of course, they have more work because they have to spray them down and disinfect them and everything. But he was there, and it was interesting to see him and catch up with him. And I was kind of glad that I didn't stick around to do that. So let's get straight to the album review. Okay, so first we're going to go through the tracks one by one and just quickly go through the album from start to finish. Up first is Red, Black, and Blue. This is an energetic opener, pretty heavy sound. There is a guitar riff that sounds like old White Zombie, so you can kind of get an idea of what the sound is like on this track. It's a great opening song. Number 2, We Are Chaos. This song sounds like it could be on the ending credits of a movie where all of the characters died unexpectedly. It's got kind of a cinematic sound, but it's kind of also dark and a little bit heavy. Number 3, Don't Chase the Dead. This song has a very awesome, heavy kind of goth rock sound, like goth rock from the 80s. Kind of a darker sound, but not super heavy. Number 4, Paint You With My Love. This is a slower, softer, piano-driven song. It sounds a lot like it's heavily influenced by David Bowie, like something from one of David Bowie's later albums. Number 5, Halfway and One Step Forward. This is a good, slower paced, dark rocker. It sort of has like even pop or R&B elements to the song. Number 6, Infinite Darkness. This is your classic, very heavy Marilyn Manson song. Number 7, Perfume. This is, for me, a standout track on the album. Get Behind Me, Satan. This track actually sounds like it could have come from the Hollywood album. So if you're familiar with the old Marilyn Manson albums, you'll know Hollywood and you'll know what those songs all sounded like. This sounds like it could have come from that album, which for a lot of fans is great, including me. Number 8, Keep My Head Together. There are some sort of 60s kind of psychedelic vibes on this track, but it's still heavy though. There's a tambourine featured prominently and like an energetic bass line. Number 9, Solve Coagula. Starts out, this track has acoustic guitar, bass, piano, and drums. And then after a bit, it gets heavy with the heavy guitar sounds. So it's kind of got that dynamic between the two different sounds. And number 10, the final track, Broken Needle. It starts out with an acoustic guitar, and then it goes to having piano, strings, and some deep electronic drums. There's also a kind of echoey Western sound on it. So this track has kind of an interesting sound where it's sort of electronic, plus sort of pop, plus sort of like a Western feel to it. This is another one that sounds like it could be on a soundtrack to a movie. And although I generally tend toward the heavier tracks, I actually think that this is the most interesting and compelling track on this album. It's really cinematic sounding, and it's also got a very interesting combination of sounds to it that you don't really ever hear anywhere else. I generally don't care much for the lower intensity tracks from Marilyn Manson, but this one is actually very good, and I would say this is my pick from the album. Okay, so let's talk about the album now. This album is a natural continuation and progression for Marilyn Manson. It's got a great combination of elements from previous releases and adds in more of a gothic rock, gothic metal sound to it. One interesting thing about this album is a lot of themes, elements, and sounds in this album are very reminiscent of David Bowie. And that's interesting because it seems that Marilyn Manson is a fan of David Bowie. I always thought that Marilyn Manson's album, The Pale Emperor, was kind of the title of the album was kind of influenced by David Bowie's persona of the Thin White Duke. I am guessing there, but it seems like it must be. I know that Marilyn Manson has said in interviews that he's always been a huge fan of David Bowie, so obviously that connection is there. So this album sounding sort of like David Bowie could be intentional, but it also could just be Marilyn Manson's influences showing through naturally. There are some parallels between David Bowie and Marilyn Manson also. As everybody knows, David Bowie had completely different personas on different albums or album cycles. And the sound would change dramatically. It would be almost like he was, everybody knows he was the master of like reinvention and changing himself. Whereas Marilyn Manson also, if you look at like where he started out and where he is at and where he's at now, there are some clear big changes there, but it's not exactly the same as David Bowie because we don't have like completely different personas and completely like albums that are completely different from the other albums. It's more of a natural progression, which isn't a bad thing. It's not necessarily saying that because he didn't do it as drastically as David Bowie that it's not as good. Conversely, it almost makes it easier for fans to keep up because you can go along with the artist and take in the new changes as they come. It's easier to keep up with. It's also kind of good for fans too, because if you were a fan of Marilyn Manson in 1995 or whatever, and then you jumped up to 2020 and they were right next to each other, you'd be like, what the heck happened? But if it's a natural progression, it's easier to keep up with, and you can take in each album and move along to the next one with the artist. Whereas with David Bowie, I think sometimes it was probably, I wasn't around for most of it, obviously, but a lot of those drastic changes were probably startling and hard to handle for a lot of fans, which is, you know, kind of why people respect him. But anyway, it's just kind of two different things, and whatever. Basically, if you liked recent Marilyn Manson albums, you're gonna like this one, especially if you're a fan of gothic rock. If you like 80s goth rock, goth bands, even like goth metal from after the 80s, a lot of that stuff is in this album. So if you were a fan of Marilyn Manson's recent albums and singles, and you also like goth rock and goth metal, you're gonna love this album. I like this album a lot. Marilyn Manson has put out some slower and softer tracks on his recent albums where it's kind of like supposed to sound deep and thoughtful because it doesn't have heavy guitars on it or something. He had a cover of a Johnny Cash song, God's Gonna Cut You Down. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the song, but it didn't excite me. It's just like a gothic take on a already kind of gothic country song. And then he had a cover of a Doors song called The End, which I was just not really a fan of. I didn't think it was very exciting or interesting. On the other hand, there are some tracks on recent albums that are just so loud and heavy that you almost want to turn the volume down a little bit because it's just so noisy, and not in a great way. What I mean to say is I find some of the slower, sort of introspective, softer songs to be not that exciting, not that interesting as Marilyn Manson songs, while a lot of the heavy in-your-face tracks sounded kind of forced and not very interesting for that reason. With that said, this album is a great midpoint between those two sounds, and this is exactly the right spot for it to be. There are some slower, softer tracks, but they're interesting and good. And there are some heavier tracks too, but they don't go overboard with it. It sounds natural and good. What I think is great is you can see with the way the sound changes from album to album, and things are evolving and changing with Marilyn Manson, it shows you that he's still striving as an artist. Whereas a lot of people would be content to say, I have this formula, it works, people love it, let's go back and do that again, let's do it again, let's do it again. He's doing different things and he's changing it up, but it's also kind of natural too. It's not like doing something else, searching for fans, or jumping into this genre because that's popular right now. It's more of a natural progression, which is refreshing to see in an artist who's been around for this long. It's great to know that he's still inspired and working as an artist, not just a performer. So, I liked this album. I give it a good grade. Check it out.